cross um, with some nails and some string, and he was talking to his cousin who has autism, and he was like, he goes, "Do you know what this is, Joseph?" And Joseph said no, and he said, he goes, "Well, this is a cross, and Jesus died on the cross for our sins." And then he stopped, and he's like, "Sins are when we're naughty." And Charity came home and told me it was super funny, super cute. There was another part of it, though. What was the first part of that made me laugh? That part was cute. There was a funny part. Oh, yeah, you guys won't get that. Never mind. It seemed like a good way to start it when I started. So I wanted to continue. A couple weeks ago, we started talking about Exodus, and I wanted to continue that. Um, but was everybody here pretty much for the first time? Okay. Well, I'm still going to catch up, so in case you don't remember. So remember that we talked about Moses and Moses being born in Exodus 1 and how he had been spared by God with, through a multitude of different things that Pharaoh was trying to do. Um, and he grew up in Pharaoh's house and then he saw an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, and so he went down to save the Israelite. And remember that at that point, he started stepping into what God had called him to do before he even knew what God had called him to do. And so he started stepping in, and the key there was that he stepped into this situation where he saved somebody's life by killing an Egyptian. And so his plan was to, I'm sure, be accepted by his people at that point. And at that point, remember that they hated him for doing that because it caused more strife. So he went out. He was on the far side of the desert. We talked about what that meant. And he had seen that woman trying to water the sheep of her father's flock, and trying to water the sheep of his father's flock, and they wouldn't let them gather any water. And so I'm learning what you've dealt with for the last 25 years. Just stay away from this side of the room. So he's watering. He goes and waters the flock, marries the daughter, and God speaks to him through a burning bush, and it tells him that he's going to set the people free. And that's kind of where we left off, which puts us in chapter 5. So if you guys want to turn to Exodus chapter 5, that's where we're going to start today. And we're going to kind of jump around a little bit because there's a lot here, and there's a lot that we don't need to talk about, and there's a lot that I feel like we do need to talk about. So in chapter 5 is the first major situation that happens with Moses and the Israelites. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Hey, you need to let my people go." And remember that in chapter 4, God says, "Go tell Pharaoh this, and then I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and then he's not going to get it. He's not going to do it." So really, Moses stepped into that moment knowing that it was going to be, for all intents and purposes, a failure. He knew stepping in that this was not going to be the moment of success. This was not going to be the moment of breakthrough. But he still did it. And he went and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said no. And then not only did he say no, he took the slave masters and he told them to stop gathering the straw to make the bricks and make the Israelites do that, right? But not only do that, but also expect from them the same amount of production as if we were giving them the materials that they need. So not only did Moses get a no, but he also tripled the workload of all of the Israelites. And so imagine for a second what that had to feel like from the Israelite standpoint. So this guy that I don't know, that grew up in the palace, who all of a sudden swooped in and killed somebody and thought that he was our Savior, says that God spoke to him, and he's going to set me free. And so I almost get behind what he's saying, right? And I almost come alongside him and say, yes, I will walk with you, Moses. This is going to be amazing. And so he goes to Pharaoh, and all the Israelites are on pins and needles. I'm quite sure. They're excited because this could be the moment of their breakthrough. This could be the moment where they get to leave. And then not only do they not get to leave, but it gets harder. And so taking that into New Testament life, our life, that very well is the church, is that we expect when somebody steps up. So in this situation, Grandpa's been here for 25 years, 7 years, 25 years. He's been here, he's said it, he's done it, he's modeled it. I have been on this platform with him through church splits. I've been on this platform with him through heartache. I left because of a myriad of things. Some of it was heartache. I've watched him stand when everyone said, yes, let's do it. And then when everyone said, I hate you, you've made it harder. Because I've seen both sides in this building over the last 25 years. I've seen, and this isn't in my notes, so I really feel like this is God because I didn't even think about this, not plan on it, didn't even think about it. I've stood up here and watched people stand up and speak out against my grandfather. I've watched it happen. And I've watched my grandpa say, no, let him talk. Let him say their piece. I've watched as he's allowed people to step up here and speak. And sometimes what they had to say was amazing, and sometimes I needed counseling after. But I've watched it happen. I've watched him allow people to at least attempt to step into what God's called them to do. And then I've watched people attack those people. And I've watched my grandpa come alongside the people who were attacked and say, it's okay. But I've watched those things happen. And what I think about as I think about over the next, hopefully 25 years that he's still here, what I think about is as I'm here and as my wife's here and as my son's here. My son is the same age almost as I was when Grandma and Grandpa came here. And I watch this, I think about the transitions, and I think about the moments today where people are saying, yes, I will stand with you. Yes, I will go with you. But what happens when the workload gets harder? Because that's where our fruit begins to show, good or bad, is when the workload gets harder. They were mad in verse 21. In verse 21, they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh. Pharaoh decided at that point when Moses came and said, let my people go, he not only said no, but he said they're lazy. So make it harder for them. They're lazy. They don't want to work. Right? So they said, you've made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. It wasn't what they expected, and they responded the way humans respond. Not, okay, it's going to get hard for a minute. Eventually it's going to be good, and we find out that it's going to be like 40 years eventually. We're talking a long time. But eventually it's going to be good. They didn't say that. What they said was, right now, I no longer stand with you. And this is where I would want to put my tail between my legs and say, God, I'm sorry, but I can't. I got nobody. Because he has nobody. He's got Aaron, who is his mouthpiece, who is probably quite a mouth, I'm guessing, because they're brothers. So I'm guessing he's like, what did you do, Moses? Do you see what's happening here? Are you sure this was God? Are you positive? Now, I'm assuming this is speculation. This is not what the Bible says, but I'm thinking as a brother, as a son, as a friend, I'm going to say, are you sure that you heard from God here? If you did, I'm with you, but are you positive that this isn't just your idea, And he's saying, no, I saw a burning bush. And Aaron's like, yeah, but you were by yourself. Like, you have no witnesses. You didn't take a selfie and post it on Facebook. None of those things happened, so I can't guarantee that happened, right? So I'm just thinking about what kind of conversation could be happening there. Even the person that Moses had as his right hand had to be thinking, oh, this is not good. Now my name is associated with this man, right? How many times have we said that? Oh, don't associate. Don't get your name mixed up with that ministry. Don't get your name mixed up with that, because what's happening is not God, or what's happening. But maybe your design is to keep your name mixed up in that ministry, to be God in that ministry, right? Okay, so none of that is in my notes. You're welcome. So we're going to jump to chapter 6. And in chapter 6, there's just one key point that I want to hit on, and it's in verse 30. It says, "But Moses said to the Lord, since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me?" So this is when God has said to Moses, yeah, that was bad. Like, that did not turn out the way I told you it was going to turn out that way, but you didn't believe me. And so now I want you to go back and say it again. And he's saying, so I speak with faltering lips. Another version says uncircumcised lips, which really means unskilled for service. He was not equipped to do the job that God's calling him to do, but God didn't care. That wasn't what this was about, was not Moses' ability. Is that my water? Maybe? Can I have it? Yeah. Thank you. It wasn't about Moses' ability. It was about Moses' obedience. So it's really important to understand, and as we walk through these next few chapters today, it's really important to understand that at the beginning, after the first failure, Moses is already saying, but I'm not set up for this. Like, this is not in my wheelhouse. The current phrase in the church is, this is not my lane. Everyone says, stay in your lane. Have you guys heard that? So that's a big thing in ministry right now, is stay in your lane. If your lane is preaching, stay in your lane. If your lane is worship, stay in your lane. Moses is saying, this is not my lane. I am not a public speaker, and I am definitely not a diplomat to go speak to royalty, because obviously he's not going to listen. But we get to chapter 7, and God starts to reveal his bigger picture. In verse 1 it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country." Next verse, in verse 3, says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you." So again, God's saying, no, I've made you like God to Pharaoh. Aaron is your prophet. I'm going to send you in there. I'm going to tell him to let my people go, and he's not going to do it. That is, so I just can't get past the dead-end ministry there. I mean, God's telling him to go and fail. And we're not just going to fail once. We're not just going to fail twice. We're going to fail over and over and over. Moses doesn't know, and notice God doesn't say at the beginning, there's going to be 17 times that you're going to ask and he's going to say no, because that's defeating. But he tells, okay, so this time you're going to go, and he's going to say no. And then it happens, and then God says, okay, but this time you're going to go, and he's still going to say no. But he doesn't give him the whole picture, because the whole picture would be overwhelming. So Charity and I right now are beginning to come up here on Sunday mornings. I don't know what the whole picture beyond Sunday mornings really looks like. But it would be overwhelming to me if I did, I'm pretty sure. Because we've got jobs, and we're involved in our home church still in Lewiston on Sunday nights. And Justice has soccer practice 3 days a week, soccer games on Saturdays, acting classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he would like to have some time with his friends. So if I knew what God was expecting of me at Cream Ridge in 5 years, I would probably not come to Cream Ridge today because I'm too busy. But what I know is that I can commit to Sunday mornings. And the next commitment that comes, will be okay, because God's not showing me the big picture to overwhelm me, but allow me to know that, okay, this is my next step. All right, you did what I asked you to do, so here's my next step. If you're faithful in the little, God will give you much. And that's what's happening here with Moses. Now, we're about to get into plagues, and they get nasty here in a minute, but especially if you really think about it. And I'm really excited to talk about it because they're gross. But think about this for a second. Think about that we go into a situation, and Moses goes into a situation, and the first time, all that happens is the Israelites have to work a little bit harder. That's all that happens. It's nothing big. There's no darkness. There's no frogs. It's just they're going to have to work a little bit harder. And then he tells him to go and do it again. And Aaron's going to throw his staff down here in a few minutes, and it's going to turn into a snake. And so, again, nothing big is going to happen quite yet, right? Because if it was big, if Moses was to know that the plague of blood was coming and that the Nile was going to turn into blood, how many know that we would start to plan ahead? We buy some bottled water to make sure that we're good through this plague, right? We would make sure that we were taken care of if we knew what was coming before it came. If we had time to plan ahead, we would plan ahead and not trust. So Moses goes, asks Pharaoh to let his people go again. He says no. Aaron throws his staff down. We're down in verse 8. And then Pharaoh's magicians come and they throw their staff down. And it turns into a snake also. So now we're back to think about the Israelites. So you got this sign from God, right? Aaron throws his staff down, it turns into a snake. But then these demonic forces come in, and they do the exact same thing, but the Israelites are supposed to believe Moses is from God. How do we know that these magicians aren't from God? Because they're doing the same thing, and we're still working. Because at this point, there's no discernment. There's no faith in the fact that God sent Moses. Right? And that has a very practical application to our life today. Because I heard years ago when Charity and I were doing youth ministry, we went to a youth conference, and there was a guy who talked about the devil, which I don't like to talk about the devil a lot, but he talked about the devil. And he talked about how the devil is a liar. He talked about how the devil is a pervert. He takes everything that God does and he perverts it. So the examples he gave, he said that God created Aaron's staff. I don't remember all the examples. I just remember one. And it's really funny, so I'm trying to save it. Build up the anticipation for the funny one. Aaron's staff. So the devil had to take that and pervert it and created a staff for the magicians to use, right? And create the ability for the magician to be able to do that. God created, one of the things he talked about was God created sex inside the bounds of marriage. But the devil had to take that and pervert that, because whatever God creates that is good, the devil wants to pervert and make it evil. Amen. And so my favorite one was, he said, God created music, so the devil created country music. And that's how that works. So, you're welcome. So we're still in the same kind of concept here. God gave Moses and Aaron a sign to prove who God was, and the devil was like, oh, I need to get to work, right? I need to be able to confuse the people. I need to make what God has created to be good and pervert it and allow the magicians to do the same thing. So each one in verse 12 threw down his staff and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up all of their staffs. Because how many know that the devil's a pervert? He's not bigger. He's not bigger. He might be able to replicate parts, but God is always greater. Greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. And that is a prime example of greater than he that is in me. Aaron's staff ate up their staff. However, Pharaoh was like, my people can do it. So, no, you're not going anywhere. So, we look at this real quick, just driving this point home, the Israelites and how they have to be responding to this leader at this point. There has to be questions, right? And Moses is 80 years old when this starts. Right here, it says in verse 7, Moses was 80 and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. So this is not like, early in his life. He probably doesn't have a ton of energy. This is not a 15-year-old kid that's just trying to figure things out. This is an 80-year-old man who is ready to retire. And people who are supposed to stand with him are beginning to question what God's doing. In verse 14, we get into the plague of blood. And when we talk about the plague of blood, really all I want to say here is that, well, let me read it. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. Say unyielding. He refuses to let the people go, right? Now pause there for a second, because it says all before that God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart, right? So he will say no. God will harden his heart. But then let's read that again. Then the Lord, God, said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. That implies that Pharaoh still had a choice. Pharaoh still had a choice to turn. When Moses came, God hardened his heart, but he didn't make it impossible. Pharaoh could have made a choice to say, okay, you know what, this makes sense to me. But he didn't. So because of that, he said, confront him on the bank of the Nile, and take in your hand the staff. Remember, we talked about 2 weeks ago that sometimes God gives us everything that we need to fulfill what he has for us. So again, God has not all of a sudden magically given him a staff out of nowhere. Take that staff right there. It's the staff Moses has had. It's the staff Moses had on the far side of the desert. It's the staff that Moses has had the whole time that God's using to create, well, turmoil is what's about to happen. So take the staff in your hand, and then it specifically says the staff that was changed into a snake. So just to drive the point home, it's the same staff. Okay? Each time God uses us, he's going to use the giftings, the things that we already possess to reach into whatever he's calling us to go do. It's the same staff. So growing up, I heard, and there's wisdom in this, it's biblical to wait on the Lord. It's biblical. What's also biblical is to go. Some people have waited their whole life. For what? Are you waiting for the staff? Because you're supposed to take the staff that was changed into a snake. You already had it. So God's like, yeah, what are we waiting for? Like, taking a long time, right? So we need to understand that God gives us our talents, our gifts, our passions before we even know what we need him for. He used that staff when he was out with the sheep. That was his staff. He wasn't turning it into a snake or getting ready to turn the Nile into blood with that at that point in his life. It was just his staff, right? Maybe it's just whatever it is you have, whatever it is you do. Maybe that's what God's going to use, but he can't use it until you have the ears to hear what it's used for. Does that make sense? Okay. So then he said, say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so they may worship me in the wilderness. We're going to fast forward down to verse 20 for the sake of time. And Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh, and his officials struck the water of the Nile, and the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, And the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. Okay, so we're going to pause there for just a second. Where were the Israelites during all this? Okay, they were working though, right? And where were they working at? In Egypt. How many know that sometimes when God gives a curse, we have to walk through it too? We're not being punished, but they had to smell the fish. They had to smell all those dead fish while they were working, because we know that if earlier Pharaoh had already tripled their workload. So it's not like he's going to say, okay, you know what, it stinks, you guys take the rest of the day, just go. No, they're still working. They're still having to deal with this, but now there's no water. And I read this 6 or 7 different times this week to make sure that it wasn't in there. Nowhere in there does it say that the Israelites were spared from this plague. Nowhere in there does it say that. It will say that in some of the plagues to come. But in this one, nowhere in it does it say that they were spared from this, that they didn't have to endure the same thing. But see, they needed, whether they did or not would be speculation at this point, but they needed to understand that there was a bigger picture than just the blood. There was a bigger picture than just the dead fish, and they had to work through it. And it was not glamorous work. It was hot, because it's Egypt. And I've never been to Egypt, but I'm pretty sure it's hot.
Amen.
It was dry. There was a lack of water. And now they're having to go find straw and build bricks with nothing but stench and dead fish. It stunk. It lasted for 7 days, which means, I don't know if you guys have ever had something rot in your house, on your property, anywhere. A deer is a prime example. So the curse lasted 7 days, but the fish were dead. Fish don't decompose in 7 days. So what happened to those fish? The stench lasted much longer than 7 days, I promise you that. And the Israelites were having to say, okay, Moses, you tripled our workload. Pharaoh thinks we're lazy. It stinks. There's nothing to drink. And you did this. And not only that, in verse 22, it says that his magicians were able to do the same thing. So again, you say you're this man of God, but his people can do the same thing. So change it back. I'm thirsty. I'm tired. It stinks. And the stink is going to get worse. Chapter 8 talks about the plague of the frogs. So, again, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they say, let my people go, and he says no, and Moses warns him, this is what's going to happen. Man, I'm going to release the frogs, and they're going to come in your house, they're going to come in your buildings, and they're just going to overtake this area. And it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he said no, and here we are again, and here come the frogs. So this is interesting, because at this point, this is where it really starts being highlighted that Pharaoh becomes a fair weather Christian. You guys know what that means? Every time something bad happens, he's like, whoa, 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 I've sinned. Sacrifice to your God, tell him I'm sorry, make the curse go away. So he says that with the frogs. And so Moses says that he will. And he does, because he's a man of his word. And at this point, I kind of suspect that Moses is still believing Pharaoh a little bit, that he said, if the frogs go, Pharaoh says this, the frogs go, then I'll let your people go. And he's like, okay. So he prays. All the frogs die. So we've got dead fish. And now we've got, it says they took all the frogs and piled them up. Have you guys smelled an alive frog? An alive frog stinks. Can you imagine a dead frog? Can you imagine a mountain of dead frogs? In Egypt, where the Israelites are working, and they're having to deal with fish, and now frogs, and blood, and making their own bricks. We got to be getting short on straw at this point. right? But Pharaoh doesn't care. It says specifically that we're not going to lighten their workload. So the frogs died in verse 13 and 14. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. The Bible specifically points out in both cases that it stank. If it stank enough that the Bible needed to go on through eternity that we knew that it stank, it stank. It was gross. But again, God didn't let go of his promise. He still said, I'm gonna get you guys out of there. So the next plague is the plague of gnats. So just touching on this for just a second, we're going through all these plagues, and again, I was struck, and I just need to drive this point, that the children of God had to endure this as well. We think that because we've got Jesus, that it's going to be easy, but it's not. We think that because we have the gift of salvation, we also get the gift of escape, but we don't. I mean, yes, eternity, we have the gift of escape. Staying away from this side of the room. But while we're here on earth, it's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be. People are going to hate us, and we're going to get there in a minute. I've already went a half an hour. I know that's nothing, but for me it's a bit. So verse 18 in chapter 8 talks about the gnats, and it says, "But the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not." Now listen to this. "Since the gnats were on the people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, 'This is the finger of God.' But Pharaoh's heart was hard." So at this point, even the magicians are saying, "Get these people out of here. Like, we can produce a couple frogs. We can turn some water into blood. We can't do gnats, and this freaks me out." Right? Because if we can't do this, what can't we do next that he's going to do that's going to make our lives terrible? Now, remember 2 weeks ago we talked about how that all the Israelite women were to go to their Egyptian neighbors and say, "Give me your stuff," and they're going to give it to them gladly. Why? Blood, fish, frogs, gnats. Get them out of here. So, again, so the gnats come, it's terrible. Pharaoh goes and says, "Go offer sacrifices to your God, get rid of the gnats, and I'll let your people go." And I just think, so I want to pause there for a second and think about all the empty promises that people have given us. And how easy it is when somebody says, "Oh, do this and I'll do this," and they don't do their end of the bargain, how easy it is for disappointment to come in, for defeat to come in. For us to say, "You know what? Why? Why do I even bother?" I do this all the time. My wife and I'm always whining about somebody who didn't do what they said they were going to do for me. But the fact of the matter is that Moses never lost heart. He did have some emotions, and we're going to talk about emotions in a minute. He did have some emotions, but he never lost sight of the fact that God spoke to him. How many know that he wasn't in the minute when God said, "Go tell him to let my people go," he wasn't like, "Yes," at this point. But he was holding on to the promise way back with the burning bush. Because if he was just looking at the fact that Pharaoh isn't going to let my people go again, because at this point, even though Pharaoh's saying he's going to, Moses has to start knowing that he's lying. Like, he has to know at this point. But every time, because Moses is a man of his word, Moses goes, he prays, he gets rid of the plague. So we're going to fast forward through the rest. We got the plague of the livestock in chapter 9. And in that, this is where the Israelites begin to be spared from the curses. And why do you think that is? I have my opinion. And my opinion is God knew that really soon they're going to need that livestock because they're going to go. And they're going to need that sustenance for the first little part of the journey. And who knows what all the reason to pack their stuff on. Because remember, they're going to pillage. They're going to pirate steal all of the Egyptian stuff, and they can't carry it all, so they're going to put it on their livestock. So none of the livestock of the Israelites were killed, but all of the Egyptian livestock. And then we get into boils, which sounds terrible, where some of the peoples were completely covered in boils. And again, Israelites were spared. Then we get into hail. So God's not messing around. And every time you guys, Pharaoh says, yeah, get rid of it, and I'll let you guys go. And if Moses didn't remember what God said at the beginning, how many know that when we get back to hail, because it rains on the righteous and the unrighteous, how many know that when we get back to hail, like God spared us a couple, but now we're having to endure it again? If Moses didn't remember the beginning, the promise, he would have given up at this point because, oh my gosh, and we're not done. Then we've got locusts in chapter 10. We've got darkness in chapter 10. But notice that in every one of those plagues, there was a moment of repentance on Pharaoh's part. Every one, he said, oh my gosh, I've sinned. I have messed up and God hates me. Sacrifice to your God. Get rid of this. Tell him I'm sorry. And I don't believe that that was just lip service on his part. I believe that he believed that in the moment. Because don't we do the same thing when it comes to sin? When it comes to the, not the big stuff usually, but the little stuff? Don't we say, oh my gosh, I gossiped. Oh my gosh, I lied. Oh my gosh, I looked at porn. Oh my gosh, I did whatever it is our vice. Whatever it is our thing. Don't we always say in that moment, I'm a sinner, forgive me? Take this plague away. And what's the plague? The plague is sin, right? That's all the plague is. The plague is sin. And so we're saying, take this plague away. But the moment that the sin is taken away, the moment that the plague is gone, all of a sudden we realize that I'm the king of my world. You're not going anywhere. And then all of a sudden, something else happens. And we realize I'm a sinner. I need forgiveness. I get forgiveness, and I'm like, I'm the king of my world. You're not going anywhere. And that's what Pharaoh has done over and over and over in the book of Exodus, which is exactly what we do over and over and over in our daily life. There's two dynamics that I want to really focus on today. The first is Moses. His job didn't come easy, right? It was not like God said, do it, he did it, and it was done. This is a period of time. This is a period of time that happened. Period of time, Grandma. She was talking when I said it the first time, so I just wanted to throw it out there again. I'll get used to it eventually. So this was a period of time that he had to fight through this. It was an uphill battle for a long time, 40 years, 40 plus years. It was an uphill battle. When God sends us, he makes a way, but sometimes the way has to be cleared first. Sometimes we need to get the machete and chop we got to chop it down. So Psalms 37:23 says, the steps of a righteous man are